Welcome everyone to Red Alert, episode 5. Today my guest is Daniel Kovalik, a labor and human rights lawyer from the USA who graduated from Columbia Law School in 1993. Daniel, you're very welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
And Dan, I met yourself earlier this year because as well as a human rights lawyer, you're also an author and a documentarian with a lot of experience, decades of experience covering political news and developments in Latin America as well as other areas, including Venezuela itself. I mean, we met earlier this year. It feels like a lifetime ago since before the lockdown, but we met at the launch of your new documentary about the Sandinistas in Nicaragua.
Yes, and that was literally just before the lockdown, days before. Yeah,
absolutely. So I'm really pleased to be catching up with you again so soon because I really did enjoy your company when you were in Belfast, and hopefully once this world returns to some semblance of normality, maybe we can have you back to Belfast for a catch up, particularly on this topic. It's the topic I want to talk to you today about: the extraordinary ongoing news of a failed coup attempt in Venezuela. As it's currently the 7th of May, and as we know at the moment, 2 U.S. citizens, and Eoin Berry, 41, former Green Beret engineer, sergeant, who served at least 3 tours in Iraq between 2003 and 2007, and a Luke Denman, 34, also former Green Beret communications sergeant, also formerly deployed to Iraq, were among at least 13 individuals arrested on the previous Sunday. As part of when they were part of an incursion by sea 20 miles from Caracas. Reports say that during that 68 others were killed. At least, so I'm guessing at least 21 individuals were part of this, several boats trying to make it to shore. In the days since, it's only been about 4 days, other individuals, I believe, have surrendered themselves as part of the plot. Venezuelan soldiers are looking for anyone else who was involved in it. A lot has developed recently. A lot has come to light about who these men were and who they were working at the behest of, a mercenary company called Silver Corps. But before we get to that specifically, Dan, I was hoping to get your initial reaction as someone who follows developments in the area, to see what you think your initial reactions are. And if you could maybe also set some of the context, because this isn't the first coup or even the second coup that we've seen since Chavez came to power, and then Maduro. So what's your initial take on this frankly extraordinary piece of news?
Yes, well, I mean, it seems to me that it's pretty certain that the U.S. is behind this coup attempt. As you point out, you have a U.S. Private defense contractor involved, Silver Corp USA, based in Florida. You have at least 3 former U.S. Special Forces personnel involved in this. You have this Jordan Kudrow in particular, who founded Silver Corp 2 years ago, who apparently has some connection to the Trump White House. I read at least one report that he even briefly met with Trump at the White House. But apparently their plan was to enter Venezuela and actually apprehend Maduro and bring him to the United States. There's no way they could pull that off, of course, without U.S. sanction, right? Without U.S. permission. Meanwhile, of course, they were most likely doing so because, the U.S. has put a bounty on Maduro's head of $15 million. $15 million, right? So, it's hard for the U.S. to distance itself from this attempt. Moreover, Mike Pompeo yesterday made what we would call a non-denial denial about the U.S. involvement. He said that the U.S. had no direct involvement in this attempt. Well, that seemed a very carefully crafted statement suggesting the U.S. had indirect involvement, meaning that somehow it was supporting, these operations. Meanwhile, you have, again, this Jordan Kudrow, who's been pretty open about what happened, saying he had a contract with Juan Guaido to do this, that Juan Guaido offered him money to do this. Of course, the money that Guaido offered him would have been monies that the U.S. had seized from the Venezuelan government. The U.S. Essentially stole Citgo, the Venezuela's U.S. oil company, from Venezuela, seized its assets, and has given millions of dollars of those assets to Guaido. So, again, the monies Guaido was using was monies given to him by the U.S. So, again, it just strains credulity that the U.S., that any of this could have happened without U.S. permission. So I think it's safe to say that, the U.S. Is behind this. I think it's probably safe to assume that more of this is probably coming, that, again, I think minimally, even if they can't overthrow Maduro, the goal is going to be to sow chaos and terror throughout Venezuela.
And this does fit a pattern of United States of America's activities in Latin America. There's a long history that many people will be familiar with across that entire region. A lot of people, though, won't be. I myself, I'm not fully read on it. I'm reading the book that I got from you, The Plot to Overthrow Venezuela, How the U.S. is Orchestrating a Coup for Oil. I'm currently trying to read that frantically as much as I can to get through some of the information, but I do know enough to know that there is a history of the USA putting sanctions on Venezuela, trying to stop food, trying to stop medicine, preventing them from trading with outside countries, with the explicit aim of punishing that country and brutalizing that country to the point that its people will rise up against its leader, as well as, you say, as stealing money, freezing the assets of different Venezuelan politicians. We've seen in the past statements from the likes of Pompeo and Bolton, when he was still a White House senior military advisor, that they want regime change in Venezuela. They've been trying to get that through various different means. There was a coup last year, wasn't there? And during that period, Juan Guaido he went to the USA to meet with various different senators, the usual senators like Rubio and others, where he was essentially crowned by the United States administration as the new president of Venezuela, the legitimate and true president of Venezuela. A military coup was attempted. It failed. It led to a lot of military staff, well, not a huge number of staff, but a significant enough number of military staff having to flee across the border, where a lot of them are now stuck in Colombia, I think it is. Could you tell us a bit about that context, then, the run up to this? Because this is just another, as you say, this is just another example of a long strategy. So, what has led us to this point? Because this is, even though it is part of a long conflict, a long drawn out conflict, this is a new development. Whereas they've tried other things, they've tried the usual sanctions and supporting an opposition leader who's in the country. Tell us a little bit about that and how we got to here, and why would America, anyone out there who'd be skeptical, why would America go to these Herculean efforts to try and effect regime change in Venezuela, of all places?
Yes, well, again, as you know, it's important to note that really since the Spanish-American War in 1898, the U.S. has been actively intervening and interfering in Latin American affairs. It has, in the early part of the 20th century, the U.S. sent Marines to various countries to enforce U.S. interests of all sorts, including interests in bananas, banking, oil, you name it. There's this famous quote by U.S. General Smedley Butler, who said, it's the end of his career, that he had been sent to, this country and that country in Latin America to, help Citibank and help this bank and help this company, and then, and so, the U.S. has been very active in overthrowing governments in Latin America, again, really dating back at least to 1898. And you had, for example, again, there's so many examples one could give. Nicaragua was a great example. The U.S. had sent Marines there a number of times in the early 20th century, then set up a dictatorship. In 1934, the dictatorship of Anastasio Somoza, which was finally overthrown in 1979. The U.S. overthrew the government of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954 at the behest of United Fruit Company. So first of all, people need to understand that the U.S. overthrew Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973. So people have to understand this is really nothing new at all. This is really the continuation of a policy that really can be dated even back to the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, where, President Monroe said that this hemisphere is, the U.S.'s hemisphere, and we have the right to intervene at any time to protect
their
our
backyard.
interests.
Was that the reference to Latin America? Is it's our backyard?
That's right. And then Teddy Roosevelt would later, extend that. He would have the Teddy Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which specifically talked about the U.S.'s right to militarily intervene to protect U.S. interests in the hemisphere. And recently, the Monroe Doctrine had been invoked by the Trump administration. They openly talked about the fact that the Monroe Doctrine is still a live doctrine and that we are pursuing that specifically in Venezuela. So, that's the context. And if people want a good primer on all this, well, my book, The Plot to Overthrow Venezuela, gets into a lot of this. But another great book, well, I can't even compare mine to this book, which is a classic, Eduardo Galeano's The Open Veins of Latin America, gets into a lot of this as well. So that at least gives some historic context to all of this. So in terms of Venezuela specifically, the U.S. for about 100 years dominated Venezuela's economy, really engineered it to be not a banana republic, but an oil republic. The U.S. Dominated Venezuela's oil industry. U.S. companies controlled that oil industry for their benefit, profited from it. And this ended with the election of Hugo Chavez in 1998 in Venezuela, who would ultimately nationalize Venezuela's oil and take Venezuela's oil away from U.S. companies like ExxonMobil, like Chevron, and use that oil for the benefit of the Venezuelan people. He's used that oil revenue to build homes, to build up a healthcare system for the benefit of Venezuelans, to build up their education system, to provide, hot meals to kids at schools, this is what really upset the U.S. They want that oil not to be benefiting kids, but to be benefiting U.S. companies. And so very shortly after he was elected, the U.S. moved in various ways to try to get rid of Chavez. And this culminated in 2002, April 2002, with a successful coup that the U.S. supported. Chavez was overthrown. He was kidnapped, taken to a military base off the coast of Venezuela, and a pro-U.S. government was installed. That pro-U.S. government lasted for a couple days because the people of Venezuela took to the streets of Caracas, demanded the return of Chavez. Military officials loyal to Chavez got the upper hand, and he was restored. But this was a coup, again, which the U.S. helped orchestrate. If people want to learn more about it, they can watch a film that was done by Irish filmmakers, by the way, called The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, which documented the days of the coup. Mm-hmm. Now, but that didn't end it. So Chavez was restored, but the U.S. continued to harass Venezuela by supporting management-led strikes of the oil industry, by sanctioning Venezuela. And then, of course, Chavez died, and President Maduro was elected. He was a bus driver who became vice president, and then he was elected president. And the U.S. continued to molest Venezuela, mostly through economic means, economic sanctions. And these sanctions,
but also cyber terrorism, according to a lot of different reports out there. There have been open talks from, again, certain hawkish senators who very much want regime change, who have, for example, tweeted about blackouts before or just as they were happening, almost in a threatening way, to say, I think it was Rubio maybe who had tweeted saying, the government of Maduro will only bring darkness, and then a blackout occurred. And there are people who would say that this whole thing stinks of cyber terrorism and efforts to do what they did with Allende, as you say. Whenever they decided to make moves against Allende, one of the first things they did was to interrupt the ability of the electricity grid, to cause further panic and frustrations, which doesn't seem to be happening in Venezuela, despite the food and medicines being restricted, especially during a health crisis, for goodness sakes, and despite the blackouts that have occurred. I mean, Venezuela has no shortage of oil. It is an oil majority in terms of its economy. That is its major product, and yet there have been suspicious fires. There's been rolling blackouts. Do you think that those are accurate claims that are made about cyber terrorism in the modern world? It certainly seems to be one of the biggest new ways of waging war.
Yes, I mean, I certainly think that it's safe to say that a number of the blackouts were the result of cyber terrorism. In fact, just yesterday, there was a report of an electrical plant being attacked in Venezuela. And as you say, this is nothing new. As you mentioned, in Chile, the U.S. helped to cause blackouts there, including during a speech that Allende was giving, a national speech. We also know during the Contra War in Nicaragua, the war the U.S. sponsored to try to overthrow the Sandinista government, because the Sandinistas had finally overthrown the Anastasio Somoza dictatorship in 1979. And so the U.S. tried to punish and overthrow the Sandinista government. in response in the 80s. And one of the things that they did is supported the Contras in various terrorist activities in Nicaragua, which did include attacking electrical output systems, as well as hospitals, as well as clinics. And that's also happened in Venezuela, where there have been attacks on Cuban doctors, there's been attacks on clinics. There have been various public buildings attacked and burned down. So this is a classic playbook that the U.S. runs in these countries. So none of this should be surprising, and none of it, and it's frustrating because the U.S. media in particular, and I think it's true of the U.K. media as well, they pretend like this has never happened before, and they mock President Maduro, when he claims that there's been an attack on an electrical grid, or when he even claims that there's an attempted coup, right? They'll put, even with this attempted coup, which is, he's pretty much got these people dead to rights. They arrested two, American former special forces people. They've put videos of them on TV and shown their passports. I mean, it's hard to argue against the facts here, and yet even still, you'll see news reports here where they put coup or in quotes or whatever.
Yeah, freedom fighters. I saw a Wall Street Journal headline today had freedom fighters in inverted commas, but it's really shocking, as you say, that despite the evidence in this particular case, that they do try and play it off. And we'll get to that as well, because Guaido's team had comments about their theories. But I suppose for myself, one of the challenges really is, as you say, it's that when these things pop up, the media they'll treat them in their individual occurrences, and they might refer to the run-up, the context, but the context is always sort of like Maduro, who is a beleaguered president with challengers and great disaffection. It's like the context they set is well, this is just a very chaotic country, and this is what happens when you have very chaotic countries and shady leaders. They don't set it in the context of, this is the latest in a long line of attempts to undermine the democratic process, to commit acts of economic and military terrorism within Venezuela, totally contrary to the desires and wishes of the Venezuelan people. It's not talked about the way it would be talked about if this was being done to the American people and to the American administration. And one thing that frustrates me to no end is listening to American politicians and American media pundits prattling on about supposed interference with their body politic by Russian hackers and Facebook data collectors and things like that. It's like, this is the most fundamental attack on our country, on our sovereignty, undermining of our democracy. And it's like, do you know what the CIA does on a day-to-day basis? The hypocrisy of America complaining about interfering in someone else's country or politics it's bewildering, and they can only get away with it because they are the richest nation on earth, with the media so complicit, and with a very complicit sort of global media as well. Like you say, the European media is very much the same, although they do criticize America sometimes. But one thing that I've noticed, it came to me last year when I was observing the coup attempt that was happening. It occurred to me that this is part of the playbook of U.S. regime change. They go in, they try and undermine, they try and cause collapse from within, and whenever they can't get collapse from within, they will invade or bomb, or they'll ratchet it up to an aggressive level. But one thing that they don't seem to have managed to do in this case with Venezuela is what they managed to do with Gaddafi and what they managed to do with Saddam, and I think they succeed in a great way with Assad, although they didn't get their way there either. But it's that they have failed, I think, to paint Maduro as the big bad, as this evil character who has to be removed. He is a threat to the world. He's a threat to his own people. That's what they tend to do with these people that they want to get rid of. And I just don't think that they have succeeded either in the minds of most Americans. I don't think they really have that. A lot of them do harbor ill will towards Venezuela, but certainly not in Europe. I don't think there's a great deal of people in Europe who get really hopped up about, oh, yeah, no, that Maduro guy has to go, and he has to go now. So do you think that that's accurate? Do you think that there's a failing there in the U.S. administration? And do you think that that's why they're now, this is my view, is that that's why they're now really pushing this line that Maduro is a narco-terrorist who is the head of an international cocaine smuggling gang in alliance with the left-wing rebels of FARC in Colombia? That seems to me like that's what they're doing now, is like, oh God, we really have to make this guy the devil for everybody to come along with us.
Well, certainly. And as you know, that is the classic trope. I mean, the U.S., as you mentioned, Gaddafi was the great example. They vilified him for decades. And so when he was finally overthrown, again, a few Americans or Europeans understood what all that meant. I would say in the U.S. that probably people do think Maduro's a bad guy. I think they have been effective in vilifying him here. I think Europeans are a little more sophisticated about these things. Julian Lai famously said once, the beautiful thing about the American people is that they have no historical perspective, which is true. The Americans don't know their own history, and so they don't remember the 2002 coup in Venezuela. They don't remember yesterday, okay? So I think it's easy to paint Maduro as a bad guy, but yes, of course, this claim that he's a drug runner is just part and parcel of attempting to vilify him and to justify military intervention in that country. I should note that the U.S.'s own statistics show that Venezuela is not a significant drug transfer point. And in fact, the Washington Office on Latin America, a human rights group here, which has not been favorable to the Chavez-Maduro governments itself, has a very good report on this, showing that the claims against Maduro and Venezuela related to drugs are just completely unfounded, and that's important to point out. But the news that I listen to NPR here, which is kind of like a version of maybe the BBC. And they're very, very anti-Maduro, and their coverage of this coup has been terrible, and so I do think that the U.S. has probably laid a good propaganda groundwork, at least in the United States, for carrying out a coup. I did want to talk a bit about, a few things. I mean, one is just, again, to go back to some of the points you made, this idea that, what we're constantly told, Venezuela has all these deprivations, it's a failed state, all this stuff. And again, what many times, if not always, is left out is what sanctions have done to that country. And I think that's important to point out.
Well, tell us a bit about that then, because we've made reference to them, but what does it actually mean for the average Venezuelan person on the ground, these U.S. sanctions?
Well, I mean, specifically and most seriously, it means that Venezuela has been starved of very important life-saving medicines, for example. There's a good report by CEPR, the Center for Economic Policy Research, a report that was co-authored by economists Jeffrey Sachs and Mark Weisbrot. It was authored, I believe, in April of 2019. And they talked about the specific drugs that were being denied Venezuela due to sanctions, and those included HIV drugs, insulin, chemotherapy drugs, also dialysis equipment. And they estimated that due to the sanctions, which have starved Venezuela of such life-saving medicines and food as well, at least 40,000 Venezuelans died due to sanctions in a one-year period between 2017 and 2018. And they estimated in 2019 even more Venezuelans would die due to even more increased sanctions by the United States. So, that's what sanctions means. Tens of thousands of people being killed. These sanctions can kill more people than bombs in many cases. So then for the news to talk about deprivations in Venezuela without mentioning sanctions simply becomes a lie. It's Orwellian.
It becomes sick. It's a very sick using this sort of things as political football when they're also covering for the U.S. involvement. And there's a specific case I was reading about that I think it was last year. It was the U.S. government is investigating Mexico for a deal where I think it was two different shipments where the Venezuelans were sending oil to Mexico, and a Mexican company was returning in payment for the oil corn and trucks that can move water, big liquid carriers, trucks. So really what was happening there was that Venezuela was trying to get food and water for its own people, and the US was now saying, well, we're going to investigate this and sanctions may have to follow on Mexico perhaps, or this company for breaking our sanctions. And that's the stranglehold that they have. And yet all apparently in the interests of the Venezuelan people, because Trump and the hawks in the US Congress just really, really care about the average Venezuelan person, and they really want to help them. And if they have to starve them to death or kill them through lack of medicine to do that, well, that's just a price they are willing to pay.
Yeah, and what they do, and again, this goes back, this is, again, a long-standing playbook of the U.S. going back to at least the overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran in 1953 by the CIA. What they do is they starve a population, they starve a country, and then they blame the country for starving. And they did that to Allende in Chile in 1973. By doing that, they overthrew the longest standing constitutional democracy in Latin America, constitutional democracy, which had existed for 100 years in Chile.
And even the way that they've done that in Libya, Libya, which was a country that had a universal healthcare system and had reasonable standards of living, good standards of living for some in the cities and things like that. Now they have slaves being openly traded in markets, and the country is run by a series of different militias.
Yes, exactly. And I want to point this out because, I think for people who don't study Latin America, for kind of just the casual news consumer, one gets the impression, and I had this impression as a child before I started learning what was truly happening in Latin America in particular, one gets the impression that Latin America is just this very unstable place that, and it's so unstable that, you just have coups all the time, overthrowing governments, but that's just Latin America. That's just how they are,
And the Middle East and Africa and anywhere that the U.S. has an interest in its natural resources.
But then when you look deeper into it and you understand what's happening, you realize, oh no, this is not an inevitable part of these societies. That in fact it's the U.S. that is provoking and instigating these coups and instigating this, chaos. And that's the real nefarious part. But the way the game plan works is that the U.S. sows chaos, but is able to deny that they did it. And then the media is very helpful in that part of the process, in that denial part. And to me, that's the most infuriating part of all this, that the U.S. causes these extreme problems, again, deprivations,
death,
chaos, death, and then it successfully is able to pin it on those countries that are suffering those things. So, and Venezuela right now is the classic case of that. Venezuela is ground zero for that process. And to me, the proof is in the pudding. The fact that Maduro has lasted as long as he has, to me, demonstrates that he has popular support in Venezuela. There would be no way for him to have survived this long. And again, one thing, for example, that tends to be absent from the news coverage of this attempted coup over the weekend is the fact that it was ordinary fishermen who spotted these people trying to get into Venezuela and who called the authorities on them to stop what they were doing.
And tried to intervene, I think, from what I was reading as well. I think they might have tried to intervene themselves, just unarmed fishermen saying, what the hell's going on here and who are you?
Exactly. That is evidence that the U.S. does not have popular support in Venezuela for what it's doing. You know, we can look at another example. And then, like, I was questioned yesterday about this on a radio station here in the U.S. And he said, well, God, there were only like 20 people trying to, you know, invade Venezuela. That's not many people, you know, to have a successful coup, right? Well, it is and it isn't. The truth is, if they had popular support, it might be enough. And there is historical precedent for this. When Fidel Castro and Che Guevara and their small band of guerrillas landed back in Cuba in 1956, by the time they reached the shores due to a storm that hit their boat, La Grama, there was only 12 of them left by the time they hit land in Cuba. And yet Fidel and his band of merry people were able to ultimately overthrow the government of General Batista that was being supported by the U.S. But why? Because they had popular support and were able to gain support of the peasantry along the way and recruit more guerrillas. Now, that was probably the plan of these people. But the plan failed, and it failed before it even started because they don't have popular support. They don't have the support amongst ordinary people to carry out that type of revolution as Fidel was able to do in Cuba. That is the historical lesson here, and that's what's being lost in all this discussion.
Mm-hmm. And let's talk a bit about the people behind this. The guys who have been arrested, Mr. Denman and Mr. Berry. So they were working as mercenaries for that private U.S. Security company, or mercenaries, as they would often be called. I was reading that the Silver Corps group supposedly runs operations in over 50 different countries. And what's quite remarkable in this history, because it could have gone a very different way. There could have just been complete deniability. We have nothing to do with this. But that when the news broke that these two U.S. mercenaries had been arrested, and the interview with one was partially released on news, that this Mr. Kudrow, who runs Silver Corps, actually came out and said, yeah, those are my guys. They are actually my men. Now, he has been active, I suppose, in this discussion, but since sometime earlier this week, he's deleted all of his social media accounts and started to withdraw. So it shows perhaps like a naivety on his part that he tried to be part of the conversation, and someone has perhaps had to say to him, you need to stop talking, and pulled him back. But piecing together what I can from different news outlets, Trump is obviously implicated, and so is Mike Pompeo. Mike Pompeo obviously coming out, Secretary of State, and saying they have nothing to do with it. Juan Guaido has been implicated. His team initially were saying, we have absolutely nothing to do with this whatsoever. Don't know what you're talking about. It's got absolutely nothing to do with us. But then after this mercenary said, we were working at the behest of Silvercorp for Juan Guaido, and then Silvercorp came out and said, these are actually our people, Guaido's team have had to backtrack. And now they're saying, instead of saying this is literally nothing to do with us, they're saying, well, we did sign an exploratory agreement with them for the attack, but we never gave it the green light. Now, that's a big shift. That's a very big shift. And Kudrow, as I understand it, he's actually saying now that he has evidence. He has a contract signed by Guaido, and he has a covert audio recording of him talking to Guaido about this. I mean, actually, Guaido's team, from what I've been reading, Guaido's team initially, when the news broke, said this is obviously a false flag. This is Maduro staged this to play up to his usual thing of, oh, the US is out to get me. So that obviously doesn't work if there is a company, a private security company in America with open admission. Yeah, these were our guys. Yeah, we got caught. Sorry.
Right.
So this is remarkable in a way, isn't it? Because the history of U.S. involvement, as you said earlier in this discussion, was they sow division, they sow terrorism, they caused this devastation, and then they go, well, it actually had nothing. There's no connection to us whatsoever. They tried it with Oliver North, Reagan, and Oliver North's supplying of weapons to the Contras. There's always this like plausible deniability, but they can't get away with it this time. And in fact, Guaido, apparently, I'm only learning this today, and I know that I'm ahead of you. It's morning where you are, but Guaido's one of his aides, J.J. Rendon, apparently has admitted in a CNN interview that they provided 50,000 startup dollars to Kudrow to get this sort of thing planned and underway. Apparently Kudrow and the two U.S. mercenaries had been based in a neighboring country, something like Jamaica or something, where they were getting things ready. So there could well be a paper trail of money on top of everything else. And it really does stink, doesn't it, whenever you have so many about faces in terms of, nothing to do with us, absolutely nothing to do with us. All right, yeah, I mean, we signed a draft document for this, we did have some sort of a plan, and then saying, oh, and we gave it the seed money to get it started. But look, we really weren't we really pulled out of it the last minute. It had nothing to do with us. Do you think people are going to buy it, even in America? I mean, it just seems such a bold series of lies.
Yeah, I mean, some people will buy it here. Probably a lot, unfortunately. But you're right. They shouldn't buy it. And this is very typical. They did the same thing with the coup in Chile with Allende. They were like, yeah, we did green light it, but then we pulled that back and in the end didn't support it. And, clearly that's not true. And that's clearly not going to be the case here in Venezuela. As they say, failure, success has many fathers and failure is an orphan. This was a failure. So, of course, they're not going to take the blame for this. If it had succeeded, I'm sure they would have taken credit for what happened there. But yeah, this was a miserable failure. It was embarrassing. And so, of course, they're going to try to deny that they had anything to do with it. But again, the fingerprints of the U.S. are all over this. I think it's going to be hard to at least effectively deny U.S. involvement.
But the question, of course, will be, okay, so what comes next? And some people are speculating that these are two U.S. citizens currently in custody. It wouldn't be beyond the realm of possibility that Trump would say, give me those people back right now, or I'm going to do something about it.
Well, Mike Pompeo has already said the U.S. is going to try to get them back. So I agree that, and who knows, that could have been part of the plan, is to get some Americans captured and then use that as a pretext for invading, saying, oh, well, now we have to go get those people back. They were, they're veterans, they're, decorated, veterans of the U.S. military. I mean, again, I think that there is certainly good reason to believe that might be part of the plan.
Yeah. And no matter what happens in this, whether they are returned voluntarily or whether America ratchets this up, it seems to be that very much as we were talking about earlier on, the focus is on painting Maduro and his government as narco-terrorists and therefore justifying. Pompeo last year openly said we would legally be within our rights to invade Venezuela at this point. But I think for me that the reason that particularly rings so very, very hollow is because right on the literal border of America is Mexico, with the Mexican cartels and the amount of drugs that they must be moving. The $15 million bounty on Maduro dwarfs the $5 million bounty put on one of the Mexican cartel's chief leaders. And not only that, but within Mexico, we have seen American citizens, I think it was a family, a convoy of cars with a family in it, men, women, and children, ambushed by cartels, if I recall the story correctly, ambushed by cartels, perhaps in error, and wiped out. But there's no talk of, well, we need to invade Mexico and we need to enact regime change there, where US citizens are literally being killed and where the cartels are in power. So this is obviously an ongoing situation. It is developing. We could see a ratcheting up or we could see a withdrawal. But no matter what, we are going to see a continuance, aren't we? We're going to see a continuance of regime change because they don't give up very easily, especially when oil is involved.
Yeah, no, I think we can definitely assume that the attempt against the Venezuelan government will continue in various different forms. We didn't even mention that the U.S. has already sent warships to the coast of Venezuela.
That's right.
And that this is all being done, by the way, we have to mention that this is all being done during a worldwide pandemic is just so, frankly, sickening. At a time we should be helping other countries fight the pandemic. Instead, the U.S. is further destabilizing these countries. In the case of Cuba, for example, the U.S. prevented respirators that Cuba had bought from Switzerland from getting to Cuba. They stopped the shipment. What a crazy thing to do at this moment. As Cuba sends doctors and supplies throughout the world to fight the pandemic, the U.S. is intervening to stop countries from being able to fight this pandemic. It's just the ugliness of the U.S. empire is being exposed right now in ways it's never been exposed, and I just hope that people see that.
Yeah, and one of my previous episodes, recorded the last episode that went out. Was with the head of the chair of the Cuba support group here in Belfast, Phil, who you would have met when you were here in Belfast.
Yes.
Phil Kelly. And we were talking about exactly that, about, Cuba sends doctors and PPE, America sends sanctions and bombs and takes PPE. And indeed, that I think that reference, maybe just to round this off, that reference is so true. The U.S. empire, because this is a country that has over 1,000 different military outposts, bases, listening posts, missile silos. It's got such a reach across the entire world. It has troops stationed in Europe, the troops very close to the Russian border. It has troops dotted throughout the Middle East and various other different countries where they keep an occupancy and a presence. It is so bewildering that there are still people in this day and age who don't see that imperialism and deny it.
No, it's right. In the other, in fact, there's a book, and I'm forgetting who the author is, a fairly recent book called How America Hides an Empire, right? It's the only empire. First of all, it's the largest empire that's ever existed. The U.S. has at least 800 military bases throughout the world, probably many more that we don't even know about. But at the height of its empire, Rome had 33 international bases. During the height of the British Empire, They had like 36 military bases around the world. The U.S. has over 800. It's the largest empire that's already ever existed, and yet it's the only empire in world history that will not call itself an empire. It's one of the most incredible shell games and incredible kind of sleights of hand ever pulled off. To have the largest empire in the world, but to convince so many people that we're not an empire.
Especially for a country that was ostensibly built on revolution or rebelling from imperialism.
Well, exactly. Well, again, we could go back to that as well. I mean, about kind of the myths.
Yeah.
Upon myth that the U.S. has been built on. This great democracy, of course, that was built on slavery and murdering Native Americans. I mean, again, that's a whole nother discussion. But it is the propaganda success of the U.S. that is the greatest success the U.S. has had.
Absolutely.
More than military, more than economic, it is the greatest propaganda coup ever pulled off. And I'm hoping that it will start to fail.
What's really interesting, I think, is that during and the Cold War and post-Cold War, obviously NATO played such a huge role in the maintenance of that empire that the US ostensibly had the run of and leadership of. Now, what we're seeing now since Trump became president is a lot of unease within Europe, within the European Union. People saying we can't rely on Trump because he's too friendly with, Xi Jinping, or he's too friendly with Putin in particular. We can't rely on him. And so the knock-on effect that seems to be having is that it's bolstering calls within the European Union for PESCO and military ratcheting up of European Union sort of military endeavors to create their own version of what the United States has. I mean, one of the leaders of the Liberals in the European Union, when speaking to a Liberal Party, Lib Dem Party conference in Britain, quite openly just said, the Americans have an empire, the Russians have an empire, the Chinese have an empire, we need an empire. And I think this argument within neoliberalism and within centrist politics is very much taking on a form of the time of nation states is over. It's time to form a gang. It's time to be part of an empire. And that is just so dangerous. And it's not the direction we should be heading in at all. We should be looking at the US and saying, well, that's how not to build relations with other countries and how not to interact with the world. Not as the European Union seems to be doing, saying we need to try and emulate this and get our own version somehow. That's really disappointing. But anyway, these are different discussions for different days. Dan, I really appreciate the conversation that we've had today. It's been really illuminating. It's been great to talk about something that's ongoing. So I guess we'll watch this continue to play out, and perhaps maybe further down the line we could have a follow-up conversation to see how things have changed. I know that your eye will be firmly glued to Latin America, and I really appreciate your insights. And just thanks so much for being on the show today.
You're very welcome, and I hope to see you again soon in beautiful Belfast, a place that I really grew fond of during my time there.
Excellent. Well, absolutely. We'd love to have you back again soon. So for now, take care and stay safe, and see you again soon, I'm sure.
You too, Adam. Thank you.
Thank you.